So I can put it on my website.
Yeah.
How was your book launch?
It's okay. It's very good. And then there is room around the table. If you want, there is room here, please. Okay. Did they say they are coming up the elevator? They're lost in the building?
They said they were in the building, but they knew where they were going. They got lost, but now they know where they are.
Okay. Okay, that's...
Maybe one more minute and then we
going
can go.
around.
Yeah.
Shall we?
We could always start
Shall
since
we
she's the
start?
third speaker.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we are going to start, and our third panelist will just join us. Welcome to today's meeting. I'm really delighted and thrilled to chair this meeting because I believe that somehow I was witnessing the birth of writing this book when Christina was with us at the center, and we talked quite a bit about the book. She talked and I listened, and I was fascinated by what she was planning to do. Christina Asquith is an award-winning journalist for over 14 years who has written for the New York Times, The Economist, the Christian Science Monitor, The Guardian, and was a staff writer at the Philadelphia Inquirer. In 2007, she was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and she's a board member of ASUDA USA, an organization that empowers female immigrants and refugees of Iraqi descent that are either victims of violence or vulnerable to violence to attain economic independence and judicious social adjustment. She's currently senior editor of the Solutions Journal and adjunct professor at the University of Vermont. She received her BA in political science from Boston University and her MA in philosophy and policy from the London School of Economics. This is an amazing book, Sisters in War, a story of love, family, and survival in the new Iraq. And I really, without any exaggeration, when I started reading it, and I was having the proof copy, not this chic copy, I just couldn't set it aside. It is really a moving story of, I would say, shattered hopes in a way, and we can discuss it during the Q&A. Christina will give us some opening remark, and Manal Omar and Zainab Grush, who probably will join us any minute, will then comment on Christina's presentation on the book and also on their own experience. I had heard about Manal over many years when I was working with Iraqi women. Whenever we wanted a group of Iraqi women to come in the region and worked with USIP, the work shifted to Manal to make sure that the right women for that occasion were chosen. Manal joined USIP as a program officer for the grant program in August 2008. Previously, she was regional program manager for the Middle East for Oxfam Great Britain. She worked with Women for Women International as regional coordinator for Afghanistan, Iraq, and Sudan. And she lived in Baghdad from 2003 to 2005 and set up operations in Iraq. She also worked more than 3 years with the World Bank Development Economics Group. Her works have been profiled in the mainstream media by the Washington Times, the LA Times, the BBC, and NPR, Glamour, the London Times, and Newsweek. Her articles and opinion pieces have appeared in The Guardian, The Washington Post, Aziza magazine, and Islamica magazine. She's also on the board of director of Women Without Borders. In 2007, the Islamic magazine named her one of the 10 young visionaries shaping Islam in America. She holds an MA in Arab Studies from Georgetown University and a BA in International Relations from George Mason University. Christina, we start with you, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I would first just want to say thank you so much to the Wilson Center for giving me a home here in the summer of 2007. Without it, I really don't think I could have accomplished the book on my own. In particular, it was a real honor to work under Hala, not only because of her experience and her expertise, but also because she became a really wonderful mentor for me, and someone that I could always turn to if I was either having a writing block or a question about Sharia law. And I just really appreciated, Hala, all that you did for me while I was here. It's kind of fortuitous that Zainab's not here, because she's the main woman in my book, and you don't really know throughout the course of the book if she's going to survive. So if she doesn't show up tonight, it won't spoil the ending, at the very least. But I did just see her mother, so I do know she's around. She's on her way. I thought I'd start out just by, I'm going to make this talk as brief as possible, but I wanted to start out by saying how I got to Iraq. It's usually the first question I get. I was 29 years old, and I was finishing my second book, or my first book, and I had always dreamed of being a foreign correspondent, and I asked someone, a former war correspondent, how on earth you become a foreign correspondent, and he said, you just go, and there's no better way. So that's what I did. I did manage to land an assignment with the New York Times, but I flew myself over there, and I hitchhiked across the border from Kuwait, and I was dropped off in front of a hotel in Baghdad, and that's how it started. I thought I was going to be there for a couple months, but things turned out otherwise. I went over there to cover higher education, but really what caught my attention immediately was the way that women lived in Iraq. It was absolutely opposite of the stereotype I had of Muslim women. They could drive. Some were veiled, some were not. If you went to the university, you would find female professors. If you went to construction sites, you'd find female engineers. They were very liberated in terms of the political. Well, I'd say more in the workplace and in the public sphere. When you got into their homes, kind of behind the front doors, it was often a different story, and that was a side of Iraqi women that was not revealed to me until a couple of years I had spent there and really got to know women. But you would begin to hear stories about Iraqi judges who, whether or not they could go to work the next day was at the whim of their husband. There was a lot of abuse even among very powerful women, and daughters often, in most cases, were married to their cousins in arranged marriages. Sometimes they were allowed to say no, and sometimes they weren't. So there was a real paradox in terms of women's freedom. But the one thing that I did notice was, and was impressed by, was how much freedom they had officially under Saddam's regime. Now, they had really suffered in other ways, and that was largely due to the UN sanctions. They were living in really desperate conditions by the time the U.S. arrived in 2003. It had been almost 12 or 13 years of sanctions, and many women were struggling to feed their children. A lot of women had turned to prostitution. And so while you had, on the one hand, among the upper classes and to some extent the middle classes, a great degree of freedom, you could see that women were really suffering, and this was a society that was being slowly asphyxiated. The U.S., and particularly the Bush administration, had very grand ideas for women in Iraq in 2003, much of which were, described in an effort to, I would say, fuel the campaign to go to war. There were made promises made to women, Iraqi women, many of them expats, that the Bush administration would support all of their efforts to get into government, to liberate women, to make women an example throughout the Middle East, like that would have a ripple effect through all the other countries, much as they had hoped democracy would. And when they got to Iraq, I think that for a number of reasons, those promises faded into the background. The war initially made things, I would say the war initially, women in Iraq at the starting point of the war had very high hopes for what the future would hold for them. And the women that I follow were very much expecting that they would become these role models for women throughout the Middle East. But the first thing that went wrong was the security situation. And there was, I think it may have been actually Manal, who I should mention right now is another one of the women whose lives I follow in the book. And I remember her saying to me when I first met her that without security you cannot have women's rights. And it's a very simple concept, but you just don't often think of these things until you're on the ground and you realize that maybe you are arguing for women's rights in the Constitution, but if there's no police force, then women are afraid to leave their houses. There were, anecdotally, many instances of rape and kidnapping in the first few months of the war, but of course we'll never know the true number because the judicial system disappeared, the police force vanished, so the streets were really dominated by insurgents, by looters, by opportunists. I mean, who knows who they were. And women just didn't really feel safe to walk to the shops anymore, let alone go to the university, something that they had been doing for many years. This, of course, got progressively worse up until about 2007, as the chaos of the U.S. occupation was replaced by the bloodshed of the Civil War. And what we thought was bad in 2003 and 2004 became incredibly, incredibly worse as the Sunni and Shia began to fight, and women got caught up in the middle. Now, they are not necessarily reflected in the casualty counts, but of course for every Iraqi man who is killed, he leaves behind often a wife, daughters, and he is the breadwinner. So women were often very much forced into the workplace at the same time that they were facing a rise in a rise in the presence of Islamic radicals who didn't want women working or going to school. So they were caught in the middle, and many of them were forced into marriages that they didn't want, or into prostitution, or forced to flee the country, as is the case of the women that I follow. Things were worse for women in the ways that I've just described, but I think in order to give the complete picture of women in Iraq, you can't leave out what women were doing on the political front. And that is, ironically, and this is a war of irony, that they were making huge gains. They very effectively argued in 2004 for a quota of women in parliament of 25%, which they succeeded in getting. 25% is twice what we have here in the U.S. It's twice what exists in the U.K. And so that was a real victory for women. And there were provincial elections in January 2009, and you saw almost 100 women elected into office of all different sects and religious backgrounds and political opinions. So it was a real victory for women to have accomplished that. They also fought very hard to preserve civil law, something that existed under Saddam and well before him. In the 1950s, civil law was enacted in Iraq. And that is something that the Islamic radicals who put themselves into the government as soon as the U.S. came tried to overturn in December of 2003. And the Iraqi women, with very little U.S. help, very effectively managed to beat back that effort and preserve civil law. However, in the last few years, as the kind of finite details of the Constitution have been worked out, we've seen that they are losing this this protection. And without going into too many of the legal details, we're seeing that women are increasingly likely to face the prospect of living under Islamic law, which for Iraqi women would be a horrible setback. It would be something that if you told them this in 2003, I think they would all have been incredibly shocked, not to mention disappointed. So I'm really excited to kind of turn the microphone over to Manal and hear what she has to say. She's just come back from Baghdad. But I thought I would end by just saying that attention seems to be shifting to Afghanistan now. And while I've written this book on Iraq, I would certainly say that the book is not closed on Iraq. And Iraqi women, now more than ever, as the situation seems to be settling a little bit, have a chance to step forward. NGOs maybe can get back on the ground now, and there is a core of women in Iraq who very much need attention and support. There's about 9 programs in the State Department for Iraqi women, and Manal will tell you more about USIP. And there are lots of other programs scattered around Washington for Iraqi women, and we need to make sure that these programs are kept up, and not necessarily more money thrown at them, but that they're better and smarter, and that we support these women who we made so many promises to at the start of the war. Because I think that they do still need a lot of help. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christina. It's ironic because I was actually in Afghanistan when the war in Iraq was launched, and I was, working with some widows in Afghanistan, and they were devastated at the fact that the attention was going to clearly shift to Iraq. And it's ironic because I was in Baghdad last week, and almost the very exact same sentences I was now hearing from Iraqi widows, which was, we took a leap of faith, we took a risk, we stood by the U.S., and when they pull out, we will be the first to pay the price, we will be targeted. And that was exactly what I was hearing from the Afghan women in 2003. So, there is almost kind of history repeating itself, but also a high potential that it's going to be a cycle in terms of, where our attentions are going to span. And great lessons learned, the potential of learning across. Obviously, each country has its own specific context, but in terms of sharing the fact that the U.S. and coalition forces are in both countries, there's a lot that women can learn, particularly in negotiating their rights in the nation-building process. Two comments I just wanted to quickly make. I always, as Christina pointed out about, we're not going to really be able to tackle women's rights until we have security. On the inverse, whenever I would speak with decision makers or policymakers, I kept saying, you're not going to have security until you tackle women's rights, because they are in high in time, and women are the barometer for what's happening on the ground. Like Christina mentioned, the rapes and the kidnapping, it wasn't just a women's issue. It really demonstrated that there was no local police. It demonstrated that the feel of, accountability and, the social contract between government and citizens was completely torn apart. So it wasn't just a women's issue. It really was an indicator of things that are going to continue to happen. So every time someone in the military would tell me, look, I have, priorities, I say, you know what? I'm trying to give you a secret of how to understand Iraq, understand the women, you're going to understand Iraq. And even now we see it. There's obviously a huge amount of attention towards the large number of widows. I mean, the estimate is up to 2 million. Most people say that it's probably about 800,000. So, it's quite a large gap, but everyone agrees that there's a large number of widows. And when you look at the widows being able to access their pension fund through government, once more you see that this is going to be the primary issue in the next 5 years. There's the corruption, there's the bureaucracy. All those issues aren't just women's issues. Yet again, women are providing a red flag for larger issues on Iraq. So I think that that's kind of where women and understanding women's issues in Iraq can really serve a larger interest, and why it's so important that we understand and get it right. Since Christina did such a good job describing the situation on the ground, I thought maybe I would just update you with more recent information on Iraq, since I was in Baghdad last week and will be heading out tomorrow. In terms of some of the current issues, one of the most clear, and I think most people in the audience know, women are clearly more vulnerable on the ground. As heads of household, there's a large amount of women who are widows, who are divorcees, the unmarried women. And in the traditional society, there was a strong marriage as a safety net in terms of providing services and providing, just retirement funds. It was all done through the informal sector. Once that was divided, women just became completely vulnerable in terms of how they were going to survive. And again, they are the heads of household. A lot of times what we get from ministries is that, women are not the priority because all of Iraq has high unemployment. But women aren't just a member of a household. In most cases, they're supporting elderly parents, and, especially the women who are unmarried, and then they're supporting several children if they're widowed. So in many cases, women are having to bear the brunt of the economic hardships as well as the conflict. The challenge really hit us in 2007 and 2008. Between 2003 and 2005, women, right off the bat were really excited. They were going to leap forward, and they realized it wasn't going to come to them easily. But, Iraqi women are tough women, so they weren't, scared off by the fact that they were going to have to fight for their rights yet again. The Iraqi Personal Status Law that was introduced in 1958, Iraqi women took great pride that this was, by all analysis, leading the region in terms of women's rights. So, they did it once. They did it in some of the most hostile environments. They were more than happy to do it again. What happened in 2007 and 2008, and most people would describe that as the dark ages of Iraq, was the situation became so poor, so difficult in terms of security, in terms of survival, almost all issues fell off the radar. Women, youth, disability. No one could talk about a specific issue because the situation in Iraq was so devastated and the security situation was so heightened that it was really hard to talk about rights in any context, and specifically in women. So every time we tried to raise an issue that involved women, everyone was coming back, Iraq's a mess, how can we try and talk about women alone? So 2007, 2008 were just lost to the women's rights movement in Iraq. And a lot of friends who would call me saying, we need to do something, we need, to be able to react. Of course, a lot of this is during the election time. So although the time is lost, important decisions are still being made, particularly on the Constitution. But, most of the time what we were agreeing on is, if you're a powerful Iraqi woman, the only thing you can do in 2007 and 2008 is make sure that you survive it. Because at that point, women were being assassinated and targeted, and we needed them longer term. So, most of the women are saying, get out of the limelight, don't run for office, you need to go. It was just that bad in 2007, 2008. And as Christina pointed out, now in 2009, there is a reemergence. I wouldn't call it a window of opportunity. I'd probably call it a crack. There is a crack of an opportunity to get back in and to start making differences. This year, there is, reviewing the Constitution. The challenge for women under the Iraqi Constitution, I wouldn't say it's just as simple as living under Islamic law. It's really living under a very monolithic, archaic form of Islamic law. No one has taken the time to define what that means. What does Islamic law mean? And it means, a lot to different people. And a lot of countries in the region have been able to deconstruct and to defend women's rights using Islamic law. But that debate is absent in Iraq. And that's one of the main challenges. As the Constitution stands now, it leaves women extremely vulnerable to local religious councils, which is, something, as Christina pointed out, was just, 2003 wasn't in any woman's wildest dream. They were comforted again by that their laws were protected as far back as 1958. So, 6 years later, to be finding themselves in this position is very difficult for them. There's a lot of denial. It won't happen in Iraq, but it's clearly happening. So one of the main priorities is what's labeled as Article 41 in the Constitution, and Iraqi women are really trying to have their voices heard, saying that it's not just as simple as saying Islamic law will govern. This again is a barometer for larger conflict. It will create more sectarian and ethnic divide. So women are highlighting this. Almost every meeting I have with women's groups in Iraq, they're talking about Article 41. Ironically, when you have meetings with the Constitutional Review Committee, they're very clear that Article 41 is not on the table for discussion and is not on the table for any revision. So again, very typical. We're seeing a huge gap between all the rhetoric because we're hearing a lot of commitment towards Iraqi women. But the reality is something different. When we're coming down to the core issues, no one's willing to put the muscle behind the rhetoric. And Article 41, in the opinion of a lot of Iraqi women, is one of the most clear examples of
Can
that.
you explain what Article 41 is?
Article 41, sorry, is the Islamic law principle. Basically, all the personal status code that was formed in 1958. Personal status code deals with inheritance, deals with divorce, deals with marriage. And the 1958 laws were very liberal. Offered the option, you always had the option throughout to go to Islamic courts, but you also had a consistent civil court that would protect your rights. So there was a consistency across the nation. Article 41 takes away the civil option, so there's no civil law, and then it allows discrepancies in the regional or the provincial courts. So, for example, you can get a very scholared Islamic judge who knows his he knows his Islamic law well, who will give a very liberal interpretation towards the woman in terms of court, and which is very usually the case. The more learned they are, the more favorable it'll be towards women. But that's also very rare because not all of them have that exposure towards the details of the law. So you might get a different province that has a very conservative and strict interpretation, and women are then forced to bear the strict ruling. And of course, the primary article in the Constitution that calls for all citizens being treated equal is basically challenged by the fact that you're just basically leaving women vulnerable to the local religious courts. Again, in 2003, not an issue. Iraqi women were thinking more in terms of how do we make sure we're 50% of the parliament? How do we make sure that girls in colleges have 50% of scholarships? They never imagined that their struggles would be something involving something that their grandmothers had already struggled for and solved, decades earlier. The other tendency dealing with women's issue is to strictly look at it from a humanitarian perspective. There's clearly pockets of humanitarian crisis and need in Iraq. Iraq is a schism. You have the engineers, the doctors, all of that, but that is now a small percent, and you clearly still have areas which I call, the ghettoized areas inside Iraq, which were punished because of political affiliation. So, for example, the most obvious one in the news is Sadr City, but you have Hariya, you have Zafaniya, you have several areas throughout Baghdad alone, and then obviously pockets throughout the country where Saddam punished people politically through institutionalized poverty, sewer systems out on the street, bad education system. So that schism was created. And the tendency when we talk about women's issues is to run to the poor areas when you're talking about development programs or humanitarian assistance, and to the rich areas when you're talking about political participation. Little is done to fuse the two groups together, and that same divide has been emphasized in terms of religious and secular. So there are divisions that the aid community has caused within women as well, which is a problem. And the primary issue that people are pushing for, so for example, in terms of the humanitarian assistance toward widows, most women would be saying it's great that you're helping out widows for a short term, but we really need to examine it at a rule of law angle as well. What can we do legally to build in a system that will protect the widows? So it's the whole philosophy if, don't give them a fish, teach them to fish. Women are pushing that their rights are solidified in some formal format. And again, not only in terms of a pension program offered by different ministries, and until today, it's not clear which minister will actually pass out the pensions, but also calling for, easier access, facilitation, and then again, solidifying it in some type of legal capacity. Whenever people talk about, women in Iraq and start hashing out, I'm cautiously optimistic. I always have been, only because the strength that I find within the Iraqi women has, I think that they are going to make advancements in spite of all the international attention, not because of the international attention. There's a lot of dedication. Civil society in 2003 was almost non-existent. Now it's matured. You get a sense. The women are articulating very clearly their needs. I do believe the more empowered the Iraqi women will be, and you're getting the structure and the organization, the more they will be able to claim their rights. I mean, it's not going to be an easy struggle. You know, exactly what Christina said. The book is not closed. If anything, again, that crack can be turned into a window of opportunity. And, you know, part of my work with USIP is to keep banging the drum that, you know, we can't just forget Iraq completely. We need to have a balanced approach. And I think nothing emphasizes that greater than the women's issue.
Thank you very much, Manal. Now we turn to Zainab. Welcome. We are glad you are here. We are glad you made it, you know, out of Iraq, and you are in the book. And
Thank you.
Nice to see you in person. She grew up in Baghdad and worked for the Americans in the Green Zone before fleeing the country under death threat. And as Christina said, her story appears in the book too. Please, you have the floor.
Hi. Slut, a whore, a prostitute. That's what I was referred to. I was referred to like that because I chose to work with American men, and I was a young woman and I had no problem with it. I was referred to like that because I chose to dress the way I and my parents see appropriate, not what the neighbors saw appropriate. I was referred to like that because I had will and I wanted to control my life. And the list go on and on and on. It's to look back at my life in Iraq and compare it to my life now, it's a big difference. Excuse me. To tell you about all the differences between the life of an Iraqi woman in Iraq versus their life in America, it won't be enough to tell it today or in a month or whatever, but I'll share some experiences with you. One very interesting thing that it was mind-blowing for my husband to call him one day and telling him, it's really nice that I can go with my mom and sister to the beach, not accompanied by a male companion, somebody from the family, and not to be harassed or deemed as insolent women. But worse than that, we were not picked up to be kidnapped, and nobody was shooting at us to kill us. Because interestingly, in Iraq, this happens to women. You can be shot at and they'll try to kill you or kidnap you for doing less than that, for trying to go to college or to work. And that happened to me and to my sister. The list goes on, and some people might think this is exaggerating, but it's not, and I can give you real episodes from my life, things I lived. Iraqi women are put in a pigeonhole. You are supposed to live, talk, dress, and act in a specific way. And if you ever cross the line, you deserve to be killed, and you deserve to be kidnapped and tortured, and you're not good. Not that I'm deeming the Iraqi or the Arab culture as faulty cultures, because every culture have their own faults. But in Iraq, it got to the point where it was beyond bearable for women. And all I can say is Iraqi women need all the help they can get to get rid of the situation they're in. Their problems are more than just not being able to leave the house and do whatever they want. They can't leave the house because of security situations. If you leave the house, you're running the risk of being killed. You're running the risk of being kidnapped and tortured. More than that, they have real issues every day. They have economic issues. They have to fight. They have social and cultural norms that became so magnified after the war, and the radical groups set as this is what's normal, and whatever, if you ever cross the line, it's not acceptable. I think 7 or 10 years ago, if somebody told me I would be living this life where I decide for myself, where I'm married to a man who trusts that I'm equal to, the that I can choose for myself and can speak up my mind without being afraid and walk out, and not be scared that somebody will kill me or kidnap me. I will say, it's really good that you have as good as imagination as I do, but these things don't happen in real life. I'm grateful to all the friends and the families who let me get to where I'm at and to be the person that I am. Not a slut, not a whore, and not a prostitute. I'm a free-thinking woman. I'm a willful human being who wanted a better life for herself, for her family, and for all the Iraqi women. I just pray that the Arab women who never had the right to practice these liberties get to do this one day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zainab. We'll open the floor now to your questions and comments. I'd like to start with you. Christina, you were there when all these debates about writing the constitutions and so on was going on. And I remember we used to have workshops with Iraqi women who were planning to run for parliament. What struck me was that they never thought that the personal status law would be really compromised. I mean, the assumption was that 1958 personal status law might be a bit more modified, but not completely changed. Was that, I mean, what did you hear then? I mean, was that the main issue, or what was it?
It's the main issue for women in politics. And of course, much like here in the U.S., the things that women deal with, a quarter of a mile up the road on Capitol Hill is so different and so removed from the things that women deal with on the ground. So I don't think that most women, and certainly not in the provinces, and probably even not most university-educated women in Baghdad, were really paying attention to these sorts of things. In part because they had many other things to worry about, but also just because, I mean, look, how close of attention do we pay to the kinds of policy discussions that go on regarding women's rights up in Capitol Hill? So I think that the women were very, when they realized in 2003 that their civil law was going to be taken away from them. And just to give you a quick example of how I understood civil law, it's for me, it's much like the civil rights law in America in 1968, the kind of blanket federal decision that we cannot discriminate against race, ethnicity, gender. And so now, no matter what court you are in America, I just moved up to Vermont, so I've seen some of the courts in upstate New York, and I mean, there's judges there that don't have a college education. No matter who you get in front of you in a court system, you are protected by the civil rights law in America. That's what the law was in Iraq starting from 1958 until now. That is what has been thrown away, and that is what's being replaced by Islamic law, the kinds of law you see in Saudi Arabia. That's why women now are very, obviously concerned about this. But because there has been such chaos, and because the situation is so desperate for women, they don't really have a lot of time to get involved and to think about what their legal rights are like. They're still really living day to day. So I don't think if you spoke with the average woman in a rural area, she would really express that much concern. In fact, she might even say, well, if I have to choose between Islamic law and secular law, I'm a Muslim woman. I want to live under Islamic law, without really realizing what that means. There's a lot of education that needs to be done, and that's one of the things that groups like USAIP are trying to do. They're trying to educate women as to what it really means to live under Islamic law, and that if they don't want to, they need to start making their voices known now.
Manal, following up on this question, is your sense, since you're working with women on the ground, is that they would like to have the 1958 law back in a modified version to appease some of the Islamists, or do they look to another Islamic country and say, well, I mean, if let's say Morocco, which is now Morocco and Tunisia have the most progressive personal status law in the region, I mean, why can't we have that? I mean, what is the discussion over this issue among these women?
I mean, one thing is it going back to in terms of the interpretation over secular versus Islamic, that has taken such a political connotation. And if you look at the end of 2003, when the law was first introduced under Bremer as Resolution 137, women really took to the streets and united and had that law repealed. And it wasn't, no one was batting an eyelash about it. Now, men learned from that. I would say the political men learned from that and started courting women. So now you actually have women divided on the issue. But initially, from 137, you saw women reacting, forming, cross-sectarian and ethnic divides. They were formed coalitions to repeal that law. And it was done strategically in the sense that we're not fighting Islamic law. We're saying that your monolithic interpretation and where Islamic law stands now isn't going to apply to us. Now, the problem was men turned it to pro-family and secular, very much like our pro-family versus pro-life debates. They both sound good. How are you going to choose between that? So the new campaign was pro-family laws, which was a strict interpretation of Islamic law. And and like Christina said, one of the things that I did with focus groups on the ground with women was that, I went and asked them that very question. Do you want Islamic law or secular law? Almost 90% of the women in the rural areas were saying Islamic law. And I said, do you realize that means you might not be able to travel from governorate to governorate? I mean, women are traveling between, Basra and Mosul all the time alone. That, some people might start telling you you need to have a male companion. And they were like, are you crazy? Like, where are you getting that from? That's Saudi law. That's Iran. As the Constitution is written, that is a very strong feasibility. As the Constitution is written, a man who rapes a woman and marries her is exonerated of any crime. Under Saddam, he would be penalized instantly as a rapist. Now you have this whole debate over whether women didn't realize how it was going to be translated to the ground. Until today, nobody, I would say women and international community, aren't deconstructing the rule of law as a women's issue. They're not taking that into account. When you talk to women, from 2003 and 2009, the three priorities have been electricity, so services. Electricity is still an issue until today in Iraq. So you're probably in Baghdad getting on average 6 hours of electricity if you have access to a local generator. So you're paying a fee for it, which Iraqis weren't used to. So state electricity is still an issue. Obviously, security falls from number 1 to number 2. And then you have the food basket and the rationing and access to that type of services. Those have been consistent in terms of women's issues. Those three are articulated. What we're trying to do is highlight the longer-term safeguards so that women aren't having to worry about rights that their grandmothers have that they now don't.
Okay. Yes, please. Just wait for the mic. Just 1 minute. The mic is coming. Please, thank you.
Irene Tinker, University of California, Berkeley. You mentioned that there was some division among women. Does this follow Sunni Shia Kurd, or is it a different kind of divisions, and are those also important?
Christine.
I'll just give you a quick anecdote of a women's meeting that I attended in 2004, late 2004. There were all these women gathered around the table, and they opened up the floor. What do you want? What do you think is the most important issue we should talk about? And the first thing one woman said was ending the U.S. occupation. There were murmurs through the crowd. No, we don't. We think the Americans are good. They should stay. No, we want the Americans out. Next topic of conversation, whether or not we should let Ba'ath Party members participate in the government. Again, half the room wanted this, half the room didn't want it. About 3/4 of the way through the meeting, one woman stood up and said, that woman over there, she worked for Saddam. She shouldn't be here. We should have no women who work for Saddam in the government. So I think that it wasn't so much Sunni and Shia, but it was who worked for Saddam, who didn't work for Saddam. Then I think, as Manal explained to me, and I think she'll do a better job explaining to you, the many variations of Muslimness that you can be as a woman. You can not cover your hair and wear makeup. You can cover your hair. You can cover your hands. You can also cover your face. There are all these gradations, and women at these women's meetings were very judgmental about how how women should live, how other women should live. These were the kinds of separations that I saw at these meetings between women, not so much Sunni and Shia. What do you think, Manal?
Yeah, no, I would agree, and I would say that the judgment was strong on both sides. So, for example, one of the meetings that I had with some of the top officials, every time the word terrorist or fundamentalist or extremist or Islamist was said, these are Iraqi women, Iraqi secular women, who are very good friends of mine and champions of the women's issues. We have a strong relationship, would just subconsciously point at me with these words. And at one point, one of them caught them and said, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry, I'm not pointing at Manal, I love Manal, I'm talking about the scarf." So, the judgment was on both sides. Both the Islamicists were judging women in terms of, moral compass, but it was very political as well in terms of how much you hate Saddam suddenly took on a physical manifestation of scarf and beard for unknown reasons, because Saddam was also very anti, everybody. And then you had the thing, and I think that that's what really hurt the women. Again, if you look at how they reacted to Resolution 137, they were so swift and quick in tearing that resolution down, and how they react now. And one Kurdish woman said it perfectly, I think in terms of the ethnic divide on the political side, she said, "I'm a Kurd first, I'm a woman second." And I think that that's probably true of a lot of the Shia and the Sunni political parties. But what was sad to see was the polarization in terms of secular Islamic had then trickled down to the civil society. And, I would argue quite heavily in 2003 and 2004, I wasn't seeing that. It's exactly what Christina said. I was seeing Ba'athist and anti-Ba'athist rhetoric, not much of anything else.
Zaina,
Yes.
what did you feel? Was it Shiite Sunni or Ba'ath or what among your generation, your friends?
I strongly agree with Christina and with Manal. I don't think it's a matter of Shia, Sunni, or Kurdish. I think it's more about, first, there is like social classes in Iraq, and it's a matter of social class, which social class you belong to, and what political affiliations you had before. And so I think this whole thing about Sunni and Shia, this is just one thing that came up after the war and became so strong because people just wanted to segregate. But I don't think it's the issue at all.
Yes, please. The mic is coming. Yes.
My name's Kelly Martin. I'm from the Center for New American Security. This question's for Manal. You mentioned at one point, you said no one is willing to put the muscle behind the rhetoric. I was wondering, in your opinion, what group would you say would be most effective as far as being that muscle? Who needs to champion this cause? Is it women themselves, or is it a political group, or who would you say needs to take it on?
Definitely multi-directional. This can't sit in one group, and it's not going to sit within, I think that there needs to be a stronger play between national and international. So to leave the burden fully on national is not fair, because at times to really raise the awareness and the pressure, you need it, but it needs to be done and led by the national. So in terms of, women's issues, I always distinguish, and I think it's important because Iraq has a quota system. I always distinguish between female representatives. So the fact that Iraq has a 25% quota, in my opinion, is great, because you have the female representatives present, but they are not always going to be the women's rights defenders. In fact, a lot of these women will support the status quo. It's important they're there. We want women there. But that doesn't replace the need for women's rights defenders. And in my experience, a lot of the male parliamentarians, they were the ones who were helping me navigate the Iraqi system. A lot of the local tribal sheikhs, I was going into areas like Fallujah and Najaf and, saying, I need to get women into my program. What do I do? And again, they were the ones helping me navigate through the system. They would grill me, both the parliamentarians and especially the tribal sheikhs. They would grill me and ask me personal questions and ask me, institutional questions. But once I went through that process, then they opened up the women, for me to work with. And there would be times when I wouldn't speak to women for months. I would just meet with men. And then I would never see the men again, because I'd passed their, I called it hazing. I'd passed their test, and then they were like, go ahead and mingle with our women. We're okay with you. And when you have donors who are breathing down your neck, when you have political pressures, when you have these, goalposts, it's really hard to do. But in a situation, like Iraq and I would argue all conflict areas, you need to build that time in. Otherwise, you're going to have, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot over and over.
Christina, did you have to go through men to have access to your women in the book, or what was your experience? Because you were a foreign journalist.
No, actually, I had my husband. I was in Iraq with my then boyfriend, my now husband, and we would often have dinners where we'd go to the homes of Iraqi friends or people that worked for us, and because my husband was there, none of the women in the family were allowed to be in the dinner. Not always, but often is the case. So I would be the only woman at the table with the group, with the father, the sons, and this got kind of boring for me after a while. So I was allowed to get up and wander into the kitchen where all the women were, and of course it was a lot more fun in there, and it was also a lot more interesting. And that's how I started. That's where the seed was planted to write about women's lives.
Yes, please. Sure.
Thank you. I'm Melanie Teff with Refugees International, which is a humanitarian advocacy NGO. I was recently in the KRG in northern Iraq and talking with some government officials there. They were saying on issues of violence against women, we came under a lot of pressure internationally. We're sick of being criticized on this issue, and therefore we've finally changed some of our laws and set up some government structures to address this question. Admittedly still inadequate, but a start. My question is whether you think that in its bilateral relations with Iraq, the United States is pushing the issue enough of the need to change the laws on, for example, violence against women and the personal status issues you're talking about, and ways in which that can be done that are not counterproductive.
Chris.
I think you hit the nail on the head with the last part of your question in ways that are not counterproductive, because, of course, if you go in there, as Karen Hughes did, telling Saudi Arabian women they should all get driver's licenses, you're just going to set back your cause for years. So I think that at the same time, if you ignore the issue like the Bush administration, you get where we are now. So it is a tough one. I have full faith in Hillary Clinton and President Obama's that they are aware of this, and that and hopefully they will strike the right note. But I'm going to pass it over to Manal to answer the specifics.
It'd be exactly the same answer. I think that there's a danger of being too culturally relative, and that worries me when it comes to women's issues. There's a danger where we start, talking about, is it, I've actually had this conversation in Sudan where people would talk about, is it within the culture to rape as part of war? And, I think there's got to be some areas where we know right from wrong, and that, that applies across cultures and religion. And I think that we tend to get into these debates when it comes to women. So I think that that's, always my fear, is that we tend to get culturally relative in a negative way when it comes to women's issues on things that should be much more clear. Now, I think approach has to be led by national and taking the time again. And that's where, I feel we can make that balance, is when we're really listening. Iraqi women, I can't even begin, and I hope by reading this book you will get a sense of it, are very strong, determined women. They have the solutions. We're just not listening to them. So in many cases, it's a matter of getting. Now, a lot of times they don't have the access, and it's not just access. For example, a lot of things that we would facilitate is bringing the poor, marginalized women to talk to their provincial councils. So sometimes it's even playing the bridge. United States Institute of Peace, we play the bridge between Iraqi dialogue. It's not just about Iraqi-American dialogue. So as a third-party neutral, a lot of times we were able to bring the Islamic and the secular women together and facilitate that conversations. So there is a role for internationals to play. There's definitely a role for international pressure. But exactly like Christina said, if it's done in the wrong way, if it's done without proper listening to all people, because sometimes we'll find our favorites, people who look and sound just like us, but were born in Iraq or born in Afghanistan, and we love them. And that's dangerous. We've got to be listening to, it's best practices. Listen to all stakeholders from, a multiple discourse, and most likely you're going to find multiple solutions from them.
Yes, please.
Hi, Stephen Dahl, consultant in development. It's probably a question for Manal. So if the personal status law has been around since the 50s, it's a long time. It can't be just seen as some import from the West or something. what do you think is the allure of Islamic law, and in particular this kind of rigid, almost medieval interpretation of Islamic law that would, make it look so appealing?
I think it's, again, something Christina said in terms of the need for a lot of awareness to be done. People don't know what that means. Again, if you were to ask me, are you going to lead your life in a secular fashion or an Islamic fashion, I'm going to say in full confidence, I want to lead my life in an Islamic fashion. But for me, that means something very specific. If you ask someone else, they have a whole different way, which would for me be, very suffocating. So that's the problem, is that dialogue never took place. What happened with the first elections was a census, not an election. And everyone wanted to, assert themselves as a Shia, as a Sunni. And so people were voting, when they voted for this is what introduced all the archaic forms of Islamic interpretation thing, was people were voting without looking at issues. Most Iraqis, and I would say even the most religious Iraqis, and again, I've gone into Sistani's office, I've gone and had very liberal interpretations on women issue when you're pushed. But that's not what's being applied. It's nothing, and it's I would argue it's formally political. Most people don't realize, and in fact, until today, the 1958 law hasn't been officially repealed. And there is a strong probability that in the next 2-3 years, the 1958 law will still be the thing that's implemented. It's more longer term that the fear is. Most people don't realize what's going to happen in terms of, and most people are taking it for granted. They see their rights as something, they're going to live like their grandmother lived. They're going to live, they see it as a protected issue. Like Christina said, if the civil right was taken from the books, most people wouldn't notice until they're put in a particular situation, which is happening now because you have the large amount of widows. So widows are now being forced to stay at home for 4 months. They've never had this practice before. During these four months, it's part of an interpretation after if you're widowed or divorced, you stay at home. You're not supposed to leave the house for 4 months. Now, typically that's to provide grievance, it's to provide support. There's a whole reason behind it. But what's happening with the ripe field of corruption is during this time, people are going and forging documents, and women are being cheated out of their inheritance because they're at home and can't leave. So, there's a whole, and in such cases, almost every Islamic judge I've spoken to has said women need to leave the house. It's not a question. They're being taken advantage of. But women are stuck in the house because of one interpretation. And again, it's not seen, when you bring it up to the Islamic courts in that way, that there's this forgery going on, there's a whole different level of interpretation. It's not being looked at a pragmatic way.
Christina?
Actually, I'd be interested, Zia, in what you think is the appeal of radical Islam to so many women.
I don't think it's appealing to so many women. And like Manal said, I think if women know what it means, they will not support it at all. It's appealing to most of the men who wants to be in control. And there is a big deal about this, about shame. And you're shameful if you choose to be secular, and you have to attach, as if you're denying your religion and you're denying your culture, and you're going, like I said, there's a pigeonhole and you're going beyond the line. You have to stay home, like Manal said, because that's the honorable thing to do. And if you say, I have to leave the house because I want to care for myself and take care of the financial issue, they'll say, oh, shameless. You have no shame and no honor. But it's beneficial to the man, because while she's home staying, grieving, he can do behind her, do everything, and at the end, she has nothing. So it's not appealing to women.
I would actually have to disagree in that I found that in a lot of cases it was the women, and particularly the older women, who were the enforcers of this very rigid oppression.
But that's
right?
the whole thing, because these older women are taught, because they're honorable, so they have to stick to what's religious. They don't know what it means, but it's the honor. That's what they teach them from the beginning. When you're a little girl, they teach you have to stick to this because that's what's the honorable thing to do. And so you live all your life believing in this. And to come now and tell you, guess what? You don't see the whole picture. And the whole picture doesn't help you or help anybody. It's just helping the man who wants to control you. Then they will change their mind. And I've seen this in a lot of houses. Yes, like you said, especially the grandmother. She's like, no, we have to stick to this. We have to follow the religion 100%. You can't do this, you can't do that. But the big thing, it's not allure to Islam. Islam is being hijacked. And what it is, it's about politics, it's about power, and it's about money at this point.
And yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot of the same patriarchal issues we see globally. I mean, anything can be used in a lot of ways for control. But I mean, I think we assume, I mean, there is, for example, parental issues. I mean, there is an instinct in parents to protect their children. And, we assume that people, are making these judgments understanding. I mean, to give you an anecdote of what I'm trying to say is, 2 weeks ago, I came across this very active civil society member. He lives in the Mahmoudi area, which was once known as the Triangle of Death between Baghdad, Hilla, and Karbala. And, he was very excited and came up to me. He's like, my daughter is getting married. I'm like, congratulations. I know his oldest daughter. He's like, no, not that one. The younger one is. The younger one's 13. Now, early marriage in Iraq was almost completely, it wasn't heard of as much, a little bit under sanctions, but you weren't getting as young as 13. And, me and him just entered this debate, and I started saying, what are you thinking in terms of her physical body? I worked on a whole early marriage campaign in Yemen, so for me, it's a very passionate issue. I was like, what are you talking about? And we had this 2-hour debate, and I was saying with a large amount of widows, there's a strong probability your daughter's going to be widowed with 4 children by the age of 18. And people don't realize when you think widows, you're thinking of women in their 40s. They're in their 20s. They're young. Last week when I got back, he called and I talked to his youngest daughter, and they had canceled the engagement because he simply had not really connected the dots. He was thinking in a very traditional way, and the reason why I bring that up is because there's a mother who arranged the marriage, in terms of, I'm going to protect my daughter through marriage, which is a safety net. And when we started saying that safety net does not exist in the form that it used to, they do re-examine, they do look. You would be surprised what these dialogues and what these discussions on the ground, if provided a safe space. I mean, when it's done where we're pushing communities into corners to defend themselves, like referring to me as a fundamentalist or Islamist, I find myself suddenly defending positions I don't agree with because I feel attacked. So, approach and issues is really important. And I think that's why the knowledge is so important. It's not just secular knowledge, it's religious knowledge as well, if that's important to a community. A lot of the women in Morocco, very hardcore secular lawyers, dissected Islamic law to defend their points. Not because they necessarily had a religious framework themselves personally, but they understood the need to target the masses, the women, to be convinced of the new laws that were being introduced. And, Morocco now has one of the, most progressive laws, and it's all based on Islamic arguments. Mm-hmm. So it can be done. It has been done.
Christina, last question to you. There is a sense of fear in the book, that the insecurity that when did you start sensing that? Because all along, after the first euphoria, but then when the reality hits the ground, these people, you see that there is that fear. When
I would say I started to feel that in, well, the UN was bombed in September 2003, but I would say even through that fall and winter, most journalists felt that they were had a shield around them. In fact, I was even laughed at when I arrived there in June 2003 and said, I'm a little bit nervous about being in a war zone. And all the journalists who come from Afghanistan and Africa were laughing at me like, this idiot, she's not in a war zone. This is nothing. And of course that changed. And I think when it started to change when a black market was created for kidnapping of foreigners. And then you didn't just have to worry about being in the wrong place at the wrong time when a bomb went off, or in fact, being caught in the crossfires of U.S. military. A lot of people were injured by friendly fire, just because there's a lot of soldiers around and a lot of guns. But those incidents were you were just kind of unlucky if you were caught. But once an actual underground market was created and flourished for kidnapping, I mean, you had to worry about your concierge. I mean, you had to worry, concierge is not really concierge, the guy at the front desk. You had to worry about your driver. You had to worry about people that you trusted, because suddenly you've got this price tag over your head. And, how well do you really know them? So I would say around 2004.
No, I meant the women in the book.
I'm sorry.
That comes up.
The women, there were so many different. I would say while the women were afraid of things like random kidnappings in the beginning, in 2003 and 4, I would say they really got scared when the Islamists began to take power in 2006 or even earlier. And then it became a matter of they were fearful of not wearing a veil. And, these are women that have never worn veils in their life. And suddenly it might be as odd for them to put it on as it is for you to put it on. And Islamists, they would be much like the stories you heard in the Taliban, they might be patrolling the neighborhood. They might kill you on the spot if they see you talking to an American. In some cases, women were attacked just for wearing pants, trousers. Then the rules just all completely changed, and it just became a very, very personal, insidious attack on what many women saw as their freedom, their definition of who they are. And like Zia said, their freedom to decide their futures for themselves. This was all suddenly on the table, and that became very, very scary for them. And as a result, the fathers, of course, doing the sensible thing, would not want their daughters to leave the house. Now you're trapped in the house all day for, months going into a year with your family, with your father, and it can drive you crazy. And I think, it drove a lot of women really to the brink.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And to read more about what's happening, I recommend you get the book, and Christina is going to sign them. Thank you, Zainab. Thank you, Anand, and thank you, Christina.
Thank you, Hala.